Welcome to the Sandhills Media Ministry. We hope this production encourages and challenges you to live a more Christ-centered life. Hey, welcome to episode 4 of the Sandhills podcast. We're really excited to have this conversation. As we were looking through the news, figuring out what we wanted to talk about for this week, we saw the COP Summit going on in Glasgow, which is about climate change and climate control. And we thought, this is a conversation that's been happening a lot in our community and culture over the last 20 years especially. And so we thought maybe it'd be interesting to sit down with Pastor Erich and have a conversation about what are the stories that we grew up hearing, what are the stories being told now, what are things that regular people can engage in the conversation and be a part of the solution to be a good steward of the earth. And so, Pastor Erich and I, we're not scientists, we're not climate experts, but we are two believers who have a passion for taking care of what God has given us, and we hope that this conversation that we have edifies and encourages you to look at the world in a new way, to glorify God in a new way, and be a part of a solution to help take care of the planet that He's given us.
No, the only time you're really going to be free and fulfilled is when, as a created being, you begin to walk in the way that He's created you to operate.
But what you do need to do is just be a faithful representation of what you believe. Live it boldly, don't hedge on anything, and just simply be who you are for the sake of Christ and the gospel and the church. And don't think about it in terms of did I make sure that they understood that I think they're wrong?
In every generation, we need to evangelize the church.
There is no Christian culture. Christianity is the message of God's Son sacrificed on the cross for our salvation.
And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are we going to choose Him or not?
And I often tell people don't leave church because of God. Mm-hmm. They leave because of other people.
So I think one of the ways that we could start the conversation is talk about what kind of stories you grew up around with this topic of, the climate, because I feel like, and we were talking about this before we were recording, but that aspect of how you're taught, what you grew up hearing influences how you then obviously live your life. So what were some of the things that you kind of grew up hearing or you heard talked about?
So cards on the table. I grew up in the 90s. And I think when you think back of it, okay, did you ever see the show Captain Planet?
I heard about it and I watched some on YouTube.
Dude, they're pretty scary. I mean, looking back at it, you're like, this is just because it's so cheesy. But it's Captain Planet, and he's literally fighting one of the villains is toxic waste guy and sludge guy. I mean, it's just supposed. I mean, it's really and he's just cleaning up the earth and all that kind of stuff.
Very little creativity in those. Villain names.
I mean, don't quote me on that. YouTube them but I remember the opening animatic for during the theme, because he had a whole theme song to it, and I remember most of it, but I'm not gonna do it. But anyway, so you have the overt things where it's you got children's cartoons that are all about recycling, and I remember all the reduce, reuse, recycle and everywhere, which is great. And just personally, we grew up my parents love working out in the yard. Yard work as a kid, I hated it. But then ended up doing it actually as a job for a long time, doing landscaping. But yeah, so my experience growing up in the 90s, with my parents actually liking to cultivate, the earth around us, in their yards, loved planting things, having things grow, choosing the right plants for your area, managing it, watering your yard, taking care of things. So that care for the earth was there. I probably didn't care so much about the kind of the messaging, from media.
Sure.
But also besides recycle, that was about it. Obviously until you get to, I guess from us it was late high school, early college is when things really started ramping up.
Probably in 2010s, early 2010s.
Yeah, early 2010s, because that's, I can't remember when the film Inconvenient Truth came out, but that documentary came out, and then And then you think about like the big blockbuster movie 2012. Everyone was, remember when the
Yeah.
Mayan calendar,
Yep.
everyone was obsessed with that.
Yeah.
And it wasn't so much, the funny thing, you think about it, it wasn't so much climate was the problem, but somehow the Mayans had predicted cataclysmic climate-based
Events, nature
that,
things.
Yeah, that would
Yeah.
signal the end of the world. But yeah, you had all of that wrapped up in, I mean, so, but there was, I remember, late 2000s, early 2010s, you started having, that's when really I started hearing about, we have to do something now, or point of no return. It's going to be the end soon.
Yeah.
We're going to see a high increase in, total numbers of dead due to climate-related disasters. I mean, and you were seeing things like, Hurricane Katrina came in 2004, 2005.
Yeah.
Wiped out tons of stuff. I mean, you started seeing some big things happen, and you're like, oh, okay. But I mean, that's kind of the environment that you kind of grown. And it's just kind of slowly escalated. Like I said, kind of quiet in the 90s as far as I could tell. People who were more aware at that time or older at that time would be able to tell more. But it seems like it definitely has picked up speed, intensity, and kind of the threat level, or the perceived threat level is a lot higher now.
Yeah. And it's always interesting because one of the things is, you see these happening more and more, and then also the ability for information to spread so quickly, that you can see these things happening more and more because you have more access.
Right. I mean, how often, I mean, I feel like as long as I've been alive, California wildfires are like constantly burning.
Yeah.
But it feels like you hear about it more, and it feels worse now because you get to see the 24/7 news coverage.
You see what it actually is doing.
Right. I mean, and it is terrible. It's not
You see
saying it
people's
never
home
was. It wasn't
videos.
terrible.
Yeah.
But it's just, there is something that's a little more visceral, and I think it does raise the emotional level because we can connect to these disasters in a more intimate way than we used to.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I can recall very recently was the Texas freeze.
Yeah.
That happened last year. And it was so strange because one of the things that it's talking about, and I think this is kind of the misconception is why they changed it, because it used to be called global warming, is what I grew up hearing.
Yeah, from apparently like 70s, 80s on.
Yeah, it was global warming.
The funny thing before that, I think it was global cooling. And then global warming became the latter kind of quarter of the 20th century.
And now they just talk about extreme climate change, where places that shouldn't experience these things are experiencing them more regularly.
Right.
Versus kind of like when we had the 1,000-year floods, where it's like, oh, it's a 1,000-year flood. It's like that idea is like, oh, maybe 1,000 years isn't quite the benchmark anymore.
Right.
That we're going to kind of fast forward that. And that's kind of the mindset now is extreme climate change happening more frequently, and extreme danger from those things. And that's what I kind of grew up hearing about. And as a military kid, I got to go to a lot of different parts of the country, and they taught about it very differently in each part of the country. In Texas, they did not talk about the environment nearly as much as they did when we were in Alaska. In Alaska, it's a much bigger part of the curriculum because if you're out there, odds are good you're probably living off part of the land.
Yeah.
Or that you'll be stranded in it eventually. And so you need to know what to do. And so, or you're out on, a nature trail, and you could legitimately be the only person for 500 miles when you're out there. And so it is really a fascinating, beautiful, wonderful place. But every year it catches on fire. There gets to be a smoky season. People know about the smoky season. I remember there's a point where they were talking about handing out respiratory devices to help people who were going to school because they were so the air was so thick with smoke. And there were guys, we lived next to an airfield. They're called smoke jumpers. And what these guys, this is crazy. This is what these guys do. They go into a big C-130.
Mm-hmm.
They put on all their firefighter gear,
Dude.
a parachute, an oxygen tank, and a water tank. And they parachute
Into a wildfire?
into the center of a wildfire.
Dude, that's hardcore.
And then they do battle with it. And they literally
hardcore, man.
fight their way out of it to create a corridor to then like bring in vehicles and stuff.
Nice.
And it's crazy. And so I grew up with these guys playing basketball down the street and talking to the smoke jumpers and getting to hear about, why they do what they do and how important forest fires are. And obviously they can be deadly and terrifying,
Right.
but you would also see you'd drive through a part of the forest or a part of the wilderness after a fire a couple months later in the spring, and oh my gosh, it's beautiful. It's absolutely stunning. There's so much new life. Old, decrepit trees that had been fallen over for a long time, or things that moss and things like that that were invading or destroying life. Those things all get done away with in the fire, and then you see new life sprout up, new habitats form. Animals have better food, and it's very fascinating. I'm like, I had no idea. And in fact, forest fires are so prevalent in Alaska that they can actually continue even in the wintertime.
Bro.
Like underneath all, because there's so much packed snow and foliage that you could actually have something underneath it.
What?
Isn't that crazy?
That is crazy.
That's what a smoke jumper told me, at least. That story stuck with me.
You just dropped some knowledge. Man.
I'm like, man, I thought it was frozen. And then like ice can't freeze. I'm sorry, not. That was a dumb question. Fire can't freeze, right? That's
ice can't
wild.
freeze, dummy. It's not a fire.
Ice can't freeze. Yeah, exactly. And
no.
and that highlights how I can't talk about the environment, but I can talk about the stories that people
Correct.
hear, right?
And to be loved, like you're saying, I know that's kind of like the jump off that we're going is, obviously neither of us are really qualified or educated on climate science, climate physics, historical patterns, and haven't done the research. However, it is one of those things of, I feel like, we were talking about this, but it's like, something I was thinking about, it's like, but as Christians, we have access, not in some kind of silly way to like, we have the greatest climate scientists, but like, we do have information, knowledge, and access to the creator of our climate.
Yeah.
And he has given us instructions explicitly and probably implicitly on how we are to engage
in what
in
he
it.
created.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And that takes us back to Genesis is where this first originates, where you see God as creator, creating the cosmos, the universe, the earth very specifically and intentionally, and then us within that. And then you see a very interesting passage where he says, go and subdue it and take command over it and rule over it. And you see that humans are charged with, I remember in seminary they called it that we were the vice regents that ruled on earth on God's behalf for him and to his glory. And I was like, that's such a cool mentality, because you think of a good ruler isn't someone that's abusing his subjects,
right?
Is taking advantage of them, but is helping create a good society and a good place to be. And that's the same mentality and language that God uses to charge us to care for creation.
Right.
Is, take control of it. You're in charge. You are head honcho. But use your power wisely and facilitate growth.
Yeah, and I think that's where I want to go there, because there was a couple of specific wording in here when I was looking at this. I'm like, that is helpful. But I was thinking, just as we were talking earlier, it reminded me. So there is, I think, a helpful distinction that for Christians to think through environmental discussions, climate-related discussions, there are kind of the two extremes that I don't think Christians are allowed to go to. So as we're thinking about the environment, I guess we'll kind of define the extremes and then go back to where we can go. I feel like on one side of the extremes, you have the reckless disregard for creation. So like you said, the abuse of it, and in a certain sense, I see that, and there's something where you can see that, like, even just like you drive past a house who just haven't done anything with, and I'm yard based because that's what I did. I mowed lawns, but like you see that yard who's done nothing with it. There's trash in the yard. Things are overgrown. Plants are dried up and dead. And you're like, that's awful. Or again, you can see on the big corporate level, just, I don't like seeing neighborhoods where you clear cut every single tree and you build the houses right next to each other. And then you stick, they have regulations about, well, you got to have trees. So they stick one random tree in that space between the street and the sidewalk.
Yep, and it's like 4 feet tall and super tiny.
Right.
They're like, well, eventually, one day, this will be a tree.
It'll be bigger. And then the funny thing is you're also going, it'll be bigger and it'll be not suited to that space because you haven't given it room to grow. So it's not good for the tree. It's not good for the grass around it. It's not good for anything. So like that kind of stuff is, again, that is not managing creation well.
Right.
And that's saying, I don't care, I want a cheap house, or I don't care, I want to throw my trash out. You know, or I don't care, it's mine to do with what I want. It's my property. I can dump gas in the backyard. I can do whatever. Like, that's a bad.
Or the tire piles, things like that.
Yeah.
Or motor oil. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
They're illegal for a reason.
Absolutely. And it is one of those. So we'll get there. You know, and that would be on. You know, and
right.
because I know the reason we're talking about this is because you've got the, you know, the week we're filming it. There's the big climate convention, in Glasgow, talking about all that kind of stuff. So like on the governmental policy, I think somewhat of this side is the, I'm a little, cards on the table, a little sympathetic to, you're talking about like, get rid of the EPA. All these regulations are bad. But there's a part, like you say, like, well, some regulations are helpful because I don't want my neighbor dumping motor oil all over his backyard.
Right.
That's going to get down to the groundwater. That's going to affect everything. Like, there's a problem. But then I think you have the other extreme side where kind of we were talking about this is where you have the extreme pro-environment side that then, taking the biblical Romans language, worships creation rather than creator. And that's where, again, I think we did start to see this even in children's cartoons in the 90s. You have the kind of Mother Earth needs to be protected because it's without using religious language, they're basically saying this is a holy thing. It is, sacred, which I agree, but elevating it beyond. I even remember, again, this is a very niche example, but my older brother loved the video games Final Fantasy. It's like the Final Fantasy games for PlayStation, and they made a movie. It was like one of the first big CG, like completely CG movies, Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. I think I saw it on Prime or Netflix now. But the payoff to that movie, it was like all these aliens and these ghost armies that were coming out. But the whole kind of twist at the end was basically, but it's like these ghost aliens from our planet that we abused, and they're just mad because they want the planet back. And it's really kind of the spirit of the earth that is fighting back to protect itself. I mean, it's kind of the Fern Gullies, like that movie.
Yeah.
You had all of those types of things that are the planet is fighting back. We have to do this. And then you kind of have, and that's the extreme environment, the Mother Earth, Gaia worship, all that kind of stuff that some people who even aren't, religious, but there's this religious fervor to kind of earth above all else.
Yeah. I remember that movie, Fern Gully.
Yeah.
I remember watching it. I think we might have been in school.
Oh,
and watching it, I was just like, anyone who owns a tractor we must get rid of them. Like, I was like, it was like really weird and like it was very aggressive.
Oh, it's so aggressive. I mean, think about the modern popular version of that is Avatar.
I was about to bring up Avatar.
James Cameron's Avatar, because you have it all. You have the whole thing positioned as the natives of this planet are the good guys, fine. But the evil, the antagonists are the evil corporations who just want to mine it and harvest
the tree,
it.
The tree of life, literally.
And the tree is literally the life-giving source, the fount of all life on the planet that somehow spiritually binds all of their survival. And you're like, ooh, again, I'm not just for clear-cutting trees, but this doesn't give us life.
It goes to an extreme.
It goes to an extreme. And so I think those are the two extremes that Christians, we're not allowed to go there, in the sense of like, you can't just be led one way or another. Like that's kind of that's your cop out. Like you're not paying attention to God's word. You're not taking seriously, I think, God's commands, his nature, his plan for humanity and for redemption of humanity and redemption of creation, if you go to one of those extremes. So going back to, like you said, the original, I was just looking at it, and it does come Genesis chapter 1, right after one of my favorite verses, 26 and 27, where it talks about being made in the image of God. Oh, it's actually starting to play
in the
audiobook. But in verse 28, it says, after he made them male and female, it says, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. I love this language. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. And he talks about he's given them all the plants. The food will be yours. And it's such a big thing. And you see it echoed then in Genesis chapter 2 when, Adam's call is to actually work the earth. After he makes Adam and Eve, all these things are growing for food. Where is it? In verse 14, 15. Yeah, for verse 15, chapter 2, verse 15. He took the man, put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. So we're supposed to subdue it. We have dominion over it, but we're to take care of it. Like you said, like if you're given responsibility for a thing, you don't just trash the thing, because that's also disrespecting the person who gave it to you. Like if God gave us this wonderful planet, and we have dominion and responsibility for it, we should take care of it, because it's in a sense, again, it's kind of like it's on loan, not in this just sense that, hey, we're temporary, but it's like it's still God's. And that's to me that's the kind of the bigger worldview of the Christian worldview, is everything we have financially, our talents, everything is God's, and we're given it to steward and manage. So we should be good managers.
Yeah, and another text that I think a lot of people can not associate very well with this is actually in Deuteronomy. And John Mark Comer, who wrote The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, did a sermon series on Sabbath and how important rest is. And in that, he actually brought up a really fascinating theological perspective that I had not considered before. But you go to Deuteronomy, and you go to the law giving of Sabbath, and it says that your animals shall not do any hard work, that you shall not plow the earth, you shall not, harvest anything. You give all of that a rest, because you need rest.
Yeah.
But it also needs rest.
Right.
The animal needs rest. The ground needs rest. And we found that out after the Dust Bowl in the United States in the 1930s, when we're like, okay, we need to rotate the crops.
Yeah, dude.
And give the land a rest. And so you realize, when you look at what we've done to the planet in the last 150 years, and there's no rest for the land. It's just being constantly pounded, mined.
I think in a lot of places that is correct. And I can't remember how old we were, but I remember being in like elementary and middle school when I can't remember what period of time it was studying. Maybe it was Dust Bowl, or maybe it was, people have been doing crop rotation for a long time. Again, it's just like, I feel like it's one of those things of certain cultures and certain places just forget it, or they never learned it. But that was one of those cool things to connect when you're like, secular scientists agree that crop rotation and you need to give soil time to regain nutrients, that's important. You're like, secular scientists agree with it. Like, oh, cool. So 5,000 years ago, God told them before you guys came around that was a good idea. Exactly. And you're like, I feel like he knew. And I was reading that this today too, just getting ready for this. I think the first instance of that is in Leviticus 25, when it was talking about, there's the every 7 years there's the Sabbath for it, and then there's the big 50-year Sabbath. So like every 7 years they were supposed to not harvest.
Yeah.
Now, I think there was a particular rule about you could harvest what grew naturally. I think, assuming that there's going to be some natural stuff, some byproduct, or again, you have a plant that's grown there. It has the natural reproductive cycle to where the seed falls. It's supposed to be so you're like, because they were going to have to eat. Yeah. And you can't stockpile that much food, maybe, but
they rely on the Lord,
right? You rely on. You rely on what the Lord brings. It will be enough. You also need to be responsible, plan ahead. But yeah, giving the earth a break and seeing, and it's one of those. It does, like you said, it does multiple things, and associated with our hurry, we kind of tone our, for us Westerners, we tone down the productive side and say it's okay to not produce for a little bit. You need to rest for a little bit. And that does wonders for us. And it also, again, it replenishes things and helps you be more productive later in time. But yeah, that idea of, we need to honor it and manage it. There's something else that I was thinking of too, is you get into Romans where it says creation has also been marred by our sin. even creation is awaiting the redemption that is promised in Christ, in the in the end times, in fulfillment. Like, creation is groaning. It's kind of going like, I was not meant to function like this. Like, so that's one of the funny things too when we see about climate catastrophes, all this kind of stuff. There's part of me that's like, what's causing it? What's causing it? And yes, it is worth looking into physical causes. It is worth looking into, is it the amount of carbon we're putting in? Is it something else? But on a root level, again, for Christians, I think we have to recognize and take the step back first and go, yeah, but it's sin that's really caused this. Now, again, that's not saying that when you disrespect your wife, or when you lie to a friend, or when you cheat your boss, that's the thing that caused a hurricane. But it's saying just the fact that humanity has caused sin and brought sin into the world. It wasn't creation that brought sin into the world.
Right.
We're the ones who brought this destructive cycle.
Yeah. And that idea of sin being the ultimate culprit, and that idea of, okay, well, what are some sins that can lead to things like this happening? And the first thing I think of is greed. You can see people who lead organizations where, out of a desire to hold on to more money and not do safer equipment or safer ways of doing things or cleaner ways of doing things, decided in order for them to have a better profit margin that they're not going to value that. And that's something that we see changing a lot in the 2020s.
Sure.
So when I've got the BBC app, is how I look at a lot of my news, and I was looking at the COP26 COP26 Climate Change Summit, which is going on right now. And this is interesting. As soon as I scroll down, the first advertisement is for Walmart. Regeneration today, live better tomorrow. And it's this idyllic scene of a pasture land.
Yeah, it's got nice cultivated
and a
farmland
wind farm
with the windmills behind it.
With
the windmills behind it, man.
Saying regeneration today. And so you see this narrative that businesses are really trying to change their perception, and that they're trying to do things, whether they are successful or not will be to be seen.
Right.
But now we're seeing businesses, I think, for the first time, put a lot of money and effort into that, at the very least, a green appearance.
Yeah, there's at least, and that's one of those things. It gets dicey, and unfortunately, this is my problem. Unfortunately, it gets political. Like, we're about to go into a conversation it could sound political. I don't know why it has to, because again, it seems like one side, if you're a Republican, you're anti-environment. If you're a Democrat, you're pro-environment, and it's like, no, it doesn't have to be. Or again, if a corporation does a green week, oh, they've just totally caved. Or again, but there is the question of like, are they serious about it, or are they just chasing
keeping up appearances?
Are they just chasing marketing dollars? Because if people think they're green, they'll give them their money.
Give them their green.
Whoa. Money does grow on trees.
There it is. No, but I think you're absolutely right that's a big, because I'm looking at this bottle right now.
Right.
And it says, empty the bottle, put the cap back on, please recycle on the side. And then on the other side, it says 30% recycled bottle. Right. And so you can see that these companies really value people knowing.
They are trying. And that's one of those things where, again, even if you're of the side that's like, oh, a lot of this is hyped up, you're like, okay, is it a good thing? Could we just agree? Would it be better to not put as much trash into the world? Yeah, I mean, like, I've seen some landfill stuff, and you're like, dude, this stuff isn't like, what does it actually do? Like, I mean, it hurts me to think about it. I'm like, gosh.
Well, that's why they hide it from people. They literally build land structures so that you can't see it. Because if you do see it,
it feels, I mean, like,
you're like, ooh, I don't know about that.
I know, and it feels bad. And so you're like, okay, so like, and to me, they're like, that's a good thing to have an aversion toward just blatantly polluting, throwing trash out. And you can see certain things where you're like I remember going down to the Dominican Republic, beautiful country, gorgeous country. And yet you'd go along streets and just like, even in the mountains, there's just trash floating along riverbanks and this kind of stuff. And you're like, and it kind of hurts you a little bit, because you're like, man, this would be great if people took care of it. And so on the level where again, I think personal, like you got to start personal instead of just focusing on if only we could get, fossil fuels gone, or if only we could get this gone again. And it's easy to think, it's tempting to think political and to put all your hopes onto, the Global Climate Summit in Glasgow or the UN's
big ticket items.
Yeah, big ticket items. And you're like, okay, but why don't you just start individually and say, okay, well, what could I do? And that's not saying, maybe it is. Don't leave a ton of lights on in your house.
Yeah.
Use minimal electricity, not to your detriment, but just to the extent that you have the capacity to not be wasteful. I think that's a big thing, and that would even be kind of like just a godly principle, is
being a good steward.
Yeah,
don't waste it.
Don't just leave water running all the time. Watch your electric consumption. You brought up a great thing about just like the one that I didn't know is like the things you buy. Are we wasteful in our purchase? Are we, because it's one of those things of like, look at all these industries that consume all these resources just to produce cheap plastic goods. You're like, but they're only producing it because we're buying it.
Yeah.
So if you want to change something, maybe buy less.
Yeah. Like the whole reason that this is a 30% recycled bottle. Right. Is because people wanted it to be.
It's because people want water that they didn't have to fill up from their faucet. It's not enough that we have running water out of 4 faucets in our house, but I want to go buy it from someone who's already bottled it.
Yeah.
And then I'll throw the bottle away.
Yeah. And then one of the things that I love that we have here in the church is the water bottle refiller.
Yeah.
That's great because now I'm going to take this and I'm going to go refill it instead of getting another one.
Yeah.
That way we buy less.
Yeah, or just buy an Nalgene.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. An even better solution.
And it looks manlier if you have a Nalgene.
A Nalgene.
Or you get,
I hike.
Or you get the Contigo, to go flip top thing, or
the ones that have the straws.
Yeah. Okay.
That's
nice. those are nice.
I don't even
have to spill.
It's so easy in the car. It's great.
But that's where I would say is, even as the Christian who's figuring out, maybe you don't like the big structures who are polluting, or you think there's big problems, or maybe you don't think it's big. But whatever you think on the big global level, first look at your own life. And I think that is a Christian perspective, is in anything, whether I'm judging you for moral failures, whether I'm looking at, justice issues in the world, whether I'm looking at economic issues in the world or disparities or this kind of stuff. You're like, okay, before you go trying to solve the world's problems, what are you doing about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there are practical things that people can do.
Right.
Just like we were talking about already with water bottles, or with one of the big things is clothing. I
didn't know this one.
Clothing accounts for more pollution than all the cruise ships. And it's like, that's a lot of cruise ships. It's a lot of waste and energy that they use.
And is that just like clothing manufacturing?
So it's clothing manufacturing, and then which is fueled by clothing consumption.
Yeah,
which is fueled by clothing waste, that people will wear something 2 or 3 times and then buy the next thing and then put it in their closet for 2 years, pull it out, and hopefully give it away. But a lot of people just throw it away.
Right.
And one of the things that I had no idea about, Goodwill goes through their clothes, and any place that brings in clothes and things like that, they have to go through it and make sure that it's clean and nice. The majority of stuff that they get, they actually just throw out.
Yeah.
And that goes into a special bin, and that bin is then sold and shipped to third world countries, where then they sort through it again and find clothes that they deem are good enough. And then the majority of clothes after that are just burned in an open pit.
And there's your carbon.
And there it is. And people don't realize that. Yeah. That I'm doing something good by donating this raggedy old thing. And this is happening a lot, where they have a serious issue, especially in Africa, where they just have so many open burn pits of clothes. It's destroying their local environments and dumping carbon straight into the air.
So I would say, tagging off of that, that's a good point where I was going to go, so I think as a Christian response, again, you first look to yourself. You first look, so what is my personal responsibility? Let me be convicted by my knowledge of the word, by my submission to God and his purpose for my life. And part of that is being a good steward. So now I will try to work my life to be a good steward. And again, that can look differently. It's not going to be a one size fit all. But then I think something that Christians need is kind of this is the Christian response, is also being educated and seeking truth. So not simply going, again, to one extreme or the other because it's convenient for me, or because I like that, or I'm predisposed to that, or because I'm lazy, or maybe because I just want to get active. It's no. Christians need to be ones pushing towards that truth, pushing towards what is, again, uncovering the truth of, no, that is actually really wasteful. Oh, okay, now that I know, I should do something.
Or and changed our buying habits as a family. We buy
Right.
clothes differently now.
Right. And I think it's also truth points you to, okay, so if I know the truth that, open burn pits are bad, can I bring education to parts of the world on how to manage climate better? Like, I know there's missionaries and stuff who do agricultural missions and how to better plan irrigation for crops, how to get more successful bounty, all this kind of stuff. And you're like, I think that is also the role of Christians, is to pursue truth, to also bring truth. So bring clarity to places, because we want to respect the way God has created our world. We should seek to know it, and then also kind of know what works best for it. And I think that also, brings to, there can be a lack of clarity around the discussion of climate change now. Kind of like we said from the beginning. It used to be global freeze, now it's global warming, now it's just climate change. So in a literal sense, the language is not really clear. On a policy sense, it's not really clear.
Things change all the time.
Is solar really helpful? Is wind really helpful? Or, I remember I was hearing people talk about, one of the big studies people cite is this, I think it's called the International Panel on Climate Change from the UN, the IPCC report it brought up the whole number. Like when you start hearing people talk about, we've got 12 years before some kind of point of no return. And again, you have to, I want to put cards on the table. I'm not the expert on it. I've heard some informed people discuss it, but in those informed discussions, I think the honest ones will say, okay, there's been a lot of misinterpretation of some of this data, some for political reasons, or some for it was just kind of flyby. You read it too quick and you came to some conclusions. So again, I think we need to push for, don't go just to the quick, easy answer that seems like the solution you want, but let's really take our time, dig in, get to the truth of the matter. And I think the big thing is just whenever we're trying to figure out what to do, you got to figure out what is our goal, what's important. And I would say as Christians, again, the earth is important, but people also have to be a major factor, and recognize there's multiple factors. So in those countries where they're having to burn clothes, it's like, okay, so you could say, hey, no more open burns. What are they going to do with all that? You're just going to bury it. You're just going to there aren't always easy solutions,
right?
So you have to be committed to kind of a long haul approach and working through what's actually going to bring about change. And maybe a bigger factor is, do we need to help people develop? I know developing countries are some of the biggest polluters, because because let's face it, carbon fuels and these kinds of things, they're the cheapest, they're the easiest, and so they need them.
Yeah. And they don't have the infrastructure to create. When you think about our trash superhighways in the United States, that we have people driving around in trucks all day, every day, picking up trash,
right,
and moving it around. That's simply just not the case. They can't afford it. The society is set up differently.
Right.
The wealth is going different places. And so, like you're talking about those missionaries that go, what are the organizations and people that you can support? If you can't go yourself, what can you support?
Sure.
And it's as easy as a Google search.
Oh yeah. It's kind of the put your money where your mouth is a little bit, but also again, just find the people. I would say find people and organizations that are trying to base solutions. And it won't always be a Christian-based organization, but just generally, even climate-related. Find people who are trying to base solutions on careful consideration of all the facts, and again, not trying to push one way or the other.
Right.
One simple person, or kind of, it's not just a resource, it's more of a person who I've heard, who I thought has been a very balanced person on this. And as far as I know, I don't think he's a believer or anything, but his name is Bjorn Lomborg. I mean,
Wow.
with a name like that, why wouldn't you listen to him?
I know.
Bjorn.
I
know. But so he's Danish, and he's the president of the Copenhagen Consensus Center, which is a think tank which does kind of environmental assessment, cost-benefit analysis, and he's done stuff for like nations, organizations, stuff. I think he's a balanced person that, again, don't just take everything he says at face value, but I think he would be a voice to listen to go, oh, okay, how can I get a balanced perspective? But in all sorts of topics where there is controversy, I always encourage, people, Christian or non, but particularly Christians, like, listen to both sides. Like, I listened to CNN had a little podcast, which was called like 5 things that you need to know about, and they were talking about this climate summit and climate change and everything, and they were much more fairly on the negative side, just kind of highlighting if stuff doesn't happen, this will be really bad. Da 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 da. I mean, and then go and listen to someone like Bjorn Lomborg, and you can find it. Like, I think he's done a couple PragerU videos or TED Talks, and then go listen to a clip from Vox, which will have a ton of stuff on climate change. Go listen to something from, go read an article on The Blaze or the Daily Wire, and you'll see both sides. And honestly, you'll probably find that truth is maybe somewhere in the middle a little bit. And don't write people off immediately. Don't just go, it's a hippie Greenpeace person, or you just want to dump pollution in the waters. Like, let's actually try to work towards a solution.
Right. Instead of polarize each other.
Right.
Yeah. And again, that's one of the big reasons why we're talking about this as pastors, is that pastors are incredibly influential voices in communities. We stand up in front of groups of people. In your case, the next generation you get to speak to.
Yo.
And
students.
And we get to hear how we grew up hearing about it.
Yeah.
How are the next generation growing up hearing about it? How are the people in our circles of influence hearing about it? And that doesn't mean you have to go around, hitting people over the head and yelling at them. That is never a good approach with anything.
No, and I think that's the problem that you see with people, and when you get kind of in those polarized camps, no one moves. You're in that camp. You're not going to be persuaded by the person saying, you're not going to be persuaded by someone saying you shouldn't have a car. You're like, no, I want that.
Or who's yelling at you and insulting you simultaneously.
Right, but the environmentalist isn't going to be persuaded by, this is our earth, we get to do with what we want. Like, no, it doesn't do it. Like,
but what people listen to is the person who in the board meeting, is realizing that there's some kind of waste in their office and going, hey, have we thought about maybe trying this out? And then they're going, oh, that might be a good solution. And you can have small conversations. Right. You can notice things and be an influential voice of change. And so I think that's what we're trying to really communicate today, is that idea of think about it. Know that God is calling every believer, every human, really. I mean, you see this as a general charge to humanity, but Christians can understand it on a much deeper level. But this idea that we're called to be good stewards of this earth and to take care of this earth. Right. And if you need some convincing, you can watch David Attenborough.
Oh, Planet Earth.
On Planet Earth with a great accent. You can see some cute penguins and stuff, and you can see parts of the world that you probably haven't seen before.
And this is maybe this. I know we have to draw to an end here, but that's a great segue because it reminded me of something. Yeah, so I love watching the BBC Planet Earth specials. Now they're laced with, again, I think they tell a story that doesn't necessarily jive always with the Christian narrative, but just seeing creation in all of its glory, seeing looking at these huge trees in the jungle where there's triple canopy and it's like home to millions of creatures, or the Arctic or the deserts or the deep ocean, and you're like, it is a wonderful world that God has given us. And I'm always reminded, Chris Ledley, who's the other next gen pastor here at Sandhills, and I grew up with him, he would take us backpacking. And I'll probably we can wrap up with this, but one of the things that we would do going backpacking, and the purpose of going backpacking was, we had a lot of team building stuff, but was to get out, get in creation. I remember he would give us assignments of, as we were walking in, how many colors can you count? See how many colors you can find. And I would look at on that leaf of a weed. Oh wow, there's like 2 different shades of green there. Oh, there's like a deep maroon purple over here. There's like a gradient blue in the sky. There's like a bright red on a leaf. There's a yellow flower, and you're like, God has made creation wonderful. And he one of his verses that he'd bring up, and one of the ones that I'm always stuck with is Psalm 19, 1-4. The heavens declare the glories of God, the glory of God. The skies proclaim, the works of his hands. It's day by day they pour forth speech, night after night, and there is nowhere that their voice isn't heard. And it's the idea that even in Romans 1, again, Paul makes the argument that God displays himself in creation, so that even those who haven't heard the gospel of Jesus Christ are, on some level, without excuse. There is enough of God evidenced in creation that humanity can see his glory and respond to him.
Absolutely.
And that's why I think on a deep level, Christians should have a reverence for nature, not elevating it beyond what it is, but God saw fit to create a world like this. He saw fit to create trees, animals, plants, all these shrubs and things, ecosystems, varied ecosystems, snow, desert. God saw fit to do that because it displays who he is. We should seek to understand that creation and respect it because it shows us our creator.
Thanks so much for having this conversation with me and getting to dig into this. I mean, this one of the cool things is just having these kinds of conversations can be so helpful because it helps you think about it. Yeah. So often we can just ignore it in the busyness of life. And so thanks again for being on the show, man.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you for tuning into this production from Sandhills Media Ministry. This episode was produced and hosted by John Dabeck. Audio mixing and camera work by Sean Weigner. Post-production by Erich Weigner. Special thanks to our guest, Erich Weigner. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please consider supporting us through liking, subscribing, and sharing on your social media. It is more than you know to fuel this project. If you'd like to know more about Sandhills, or if you'd like to join us on a Sunday, you can do so at sandhillschurch.org. Special thanks to Kings Kaleidoscope for supplying our song, Same Blood Instrumental.